Welcome to Fun and Games Side Quests. Every episode is a different host sharing a video game they love and why they love it.
Why, hello, and welcome to Side Quests. I'm Louie, and on today's episode, I'm going to be talking to you about a little game that delivered big on tactical fun, Shining Force, the Sword of Hajya for the SEGA Game Gear. For those who may not be familiar with the Game Gear, it was essentially Sega's answer to Nintendo's Game Boy portable system. Also, if you don't know what a Game Gear is, how did you find yourself listening to this podcast? That's pretty cool. The Sega Game Gear was an 8-bit portable game system which was released at the start of the 90s, just a year or two after the release of their 16-bit Mega Drive or Genesis home console. Architecturally, the Game Gear was similar to Sega's previous home console, known here in the West as the Sega Master System, which was essentially a contemporary to the Nintendo Entertainment System. The Game Gear was mostly known for three things: having a color backlit screen, being bulky, and absolutely devouring batteries. In fact, it's generally agreed upon these days that one of the factors that really cemented the Game Boy's win against the likes of the technically superior Game Gear, as well as Atari's Lynx and NEC's Turbo Express handhelds, is the fact you could actually get more than a few hours out of a set of batteries playing Nintendo's Beige Brick. And what could you expect for 6 AA batteries in your Game Gear? About 3 hours. Maybe more if you had the brightness and the volume turned way low. Okay, that's the Game Gear. So what's a Shining Force anyway? The original Shining Force was a fantasy tactical role-playing game released for the Sega Genesis in '92, a spin-off of Shining in the Darkness, which was a traditional turn-based RPG with first-person dungeon exploration. According to interviews with the game's producer, Hiroyuki Takahashi, the goal with Shining Force was to make turn-based RPG battles more fun by adding the tactical elements of individual unit movement. In addition, it is said that he found that other tactical RPGs at the time had, quote, bad tempo, and he sought to create a faster-paced game in the genre. But that's the Genesis original. What about the Game Gear? What we got here in North America as Shining Force the Sword of Hajya in '94 was originally released in Japan as Shining Force Gaiden 2 in '93. That's right, what we got here in the West was actually the second game in the Gaiden spin-off series for the Game Gear. Look, imports and localization was a mess back in the 90s. Just imagine it's 1997 and Final Fantasy VII comes out and you're like, wait, the last Final Fantasy game was FF3. Now we're at 7? What happened to 4, 5, and 6? But it's worse than that, because turns out what you've been calling Final Fantasy 3 is actually 6, and what you've been missing is actually 3, 4, and 5. And what a mess. Look, all this to say that stuff like this was quite common at the time. But for us, on this side of the globe, Shining Force the Sword of Hajya was the first time we got to take the series with us on the go, as long as we had a bag full of batteries. Okay, so it's a turn-based RPG. By that, I mean the kind of game where you command an army of individual soldiers in turn-based battles in which planning and positioning make all the difference. If you're familiar with games like Dark Wizard or early Fire Emblem games, then you probably have an idea of how the Shining Force games play. This might sound silly, but one of the standout features of this series for me has always been the battle animations. The Shining Force games were not the first to do these sort of cutaways from the top-down perspective of the battlefield to show a more detailed animation of the characters trading blows when attacking, but the use of a more cinematic three-quarter behind-the-back view really made Shining Force stand out. The Game Gear version does a great job of reproducing these animations in an albeit simplified manner. Presentation in this game is great across the board, actually, considering the hardware. On the audio front, the game does a perfectly fine job. The soundtrack isn't terribly varied, but every tune fits great with the tone of each fight and cutscene. And speaking of the cutscenes, if you're into old school RPG cutscenes where the little chibi sprites pantomime around the screen, I think you'd really dig these. They're like a straight shot of nostalgia for me. The Game Gear could actually produce quite a few colors on screen at once, so the graphics, both in the top-down battlefield view and during the attack animations, were nice and vibrant, and the turn-based nature of the gameplay meant that the game didn't suffer much at the hand of the bad persistence blur of the LCD screen. There is a whole slew of different characters to meet and recruit along the journey, and all of them have both adorable chibi sprites and surprisingly gorgeous portraits for such a low resolution. They really help give the cast a personality, albeit a bit of a generic fantasy anime personality by today's standards, but a personality nonetheless. Look, give me a break. I was a kid when I first played. So let's talk about that then. My own experiences with the game. My journey with the game started with a practical joke. Well, hold on. No, not quite. My journey with the game really started with a department store catalog and asking a friend of mine about what RPG I should ask for if I were to get a Game Gear for my birthday or the holidays. And why my birthday or the holidays? Well, that was the beauty of the practical joke, you see. My birthday is in early December, and that's when my parents gave me a brand spanking new copy of Shining Force to Sword of Hajya. I would have to wait until Christmas to get the Game Gear on which to play it. And for those wondering, yes, my folks knew exactly what they were doing. I think they might have been trying to bribe me into getting better grades, maybe, or just thought it would be funny. I don't know. Given that it was a rather lavish gift for our family, it could also be that knowing these would be my only 2 gifts of the year, they had to decide what would be more cruel, a console with no game or a game with no console. At least the game came with a manual, and oh boy, was I intimately familiar with that manual by the time I was able to play the game. Man, I looked forward to playing that game every night. You see, partly because of the battery situation and partly because I didn't want anything to happen to my Game Gear, I never took it to school or took it out much. Most of the time, it was basically a home console plugged into the wall for unlimited playtime. And a large part of that playtime was spent at night after everyone else was fast asleep. Best thing about that backlit color screen is that you could play it just fine under the covers after lights out. And boy, did I. Shining Force was the first console RPG I ever played and also the first I ever finished. I love short, simple action games that let you jump right into the fun, but Shining Force for the Game Gear taught me the value of a slower paced, more deliberate experience. And it's a genuinely good game in context. In fact, I've been replaying it in preparation for this podcast. As a game developer with a lot of experience with mobile gaming, I can really appreciate how the Shining Force design was adapted for the Game Gear while retaining its core. If I had to guess, I would say these changes were probably a combination of tighter technical constraints when compared to the much more powerful Sega Genesis, and having to adapt the design to playing on the go. The biggest such change comes in the overhaul of how the town segments are handled between battles. In the Sega Genesis games, the player is free to control their avatar in real time to explore these town areas in order to talk to town folks, interact with shops, or the local church to heal allies and raise fallen soldiers. The Game Gear games distill all of this down to essentially a menu with 3 options: barracks for army management, shop to buy and sell equipment, and the gates to head back into battle. What the game lost in exploration, it gained back in never frustrating the player with the question of, how the hell am I supposed to proceed? And speaking of shops, I've got to tell you something really great the Shining games do. If you buy a weapon for one of your soldiers, the game immediately asks you if you would like to equip the newly purchased weapon. And you know what else? It also asks if you would like to go ahead and sell the weapon you just replaced. Yes, Shining Force, yes I would. Thank you. All this really gives the game a brisk pace that's perfect for portable play. Jump in, make some progress, frantically save your game while the battery light flashes, then put the system away until you're back home and can plug it into an outlet and resume where you left off. In fact, I think the Sword of Hajya is a pretty good example of the pressures put on portable game design. We still see this to an extent with hardware like the Nintendo Switch or Valve's Steam Deck. Lower-powered handheld systems get simplified ports, or games will ship with settings presets meant for play on these low-end devices. As already stated, the Game Gear had very similar guts to Sega's 8-bit Master System console, but hit the market after the 16-bit Genesis, meaning the Game Gear was essentially a generation behind in terms of hardware, but in a world where gamers were now enjoying the likes of the Genesis and Super Nintendo. This is extremely common when looking at the history of handheld consoles. Heck, NEC's Turbo Express was a 4-reel portable TurboGrafx 16, but was released 3 years after the TurboGrafx. As technology advances, older hardware becomes cheaper and easier to miniaturize into the basis for a portable system. Thing is, though, game design keeps evolving, and along with it, player taste and expectation. With Shining Force: The Sword of Hajya, we see a great example of this, of a design born on a home console adapted very well, in my opinion, to the Game Gear. In fact, the game's core design and story held up so well as to become the basis of a Sega CD game 4 years later. Shining Force CD was a remaster of Shining Force Gaiden and Gaiden 2, released in '94 for Sega's CD-based add-on to the Genesis. For us outside Japan, it was actually our first opportunity to play through the events of Shining Force Gaiden 1. I have not played this version myself, but all the reviews and retrospectives I've seen about it make it sound like a really great way to experience this part of the Shining Force saga. If you dabble in emulation, there are now fan translation patches available for all the Gaiden games, including the third, which was not included in Shining Force CD. I've been replaying Sword of Hajya on my 3DS personally. Sadly, with the recent shutdown of the 3DS eShop, we lost what was probably the easiest way to play the game today. Shining Force CD, on the other hand, can still be played on the Sega Genesis Mini 2 microconsole if you can track one down. So, I know this was a bit of a meandering journey. Sorry, it's just hard for me to separate my thoughts about this game from the time period I associate with it. I just have so many fond memories of playing this game late into the night, discovering how satisfying it can be to engage with a strategic game like Shining Force, to look forward to the next bit of story just beyond the next battle, to unravel the villain's plot, and finally put an end to their machinations. Shining Force: The Sword of Hajya opened my little gamer heart and mind to the fun that can be had playing games that were more than action-based instant gratification. It may be simple in both gameplay and story by my adult standards with all the gaming experiences I've had since, but at the time, it was just the perfect introduction to the tactical RPG genre. And that's Shining Force: The Sword of Hajya for the Game Gear. This has been Side Quests. I've been Louie. Thanks for listening, and happy gaming.
Hey, Jay.
Hey, Jim.
You're a fan of the Legion of Superheroes, right?
Yeah, I've been reading their adventures for decades.
Me too. It was tough at first with all the characters, but now I think I'm an expert.
It's not too hard to get into the Legion. And to make it even easier, we have a podcast called Long Live the Legion. We talk about different aspects of all its history to help you out.
So whether you're a new reader in the Legion Academy, or have your own flight ring, or anywhere in between, a Long Live the Legion podcast should be on your playlist.
CPOV. CertainPOV.com.